Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you a book review from the original 62 classic Goosebumps series. And it's book number 17, Why I'm Afraid of Bees. I'm just going to be upfront and honest. When I was a kid, I maybe read this book once or twice, and I always pegged it to be an average book, but kind of on the lower end of that, like that lower C, it's good and fine. But rereading it as an adult, I found a newfound appreciation for this book. And I actually will go out of my way to say that I think this book is just slightly underrated. Majority of people I have seen talk about this book would probably give it a middle to upper D, like it's okay, passable, which I kind of disagree with after rereading this. I think this book has a lot more substance going for it and a pretty wholesome message. And it has a story that knows what it wants to tell. And I can really commend the book for doing that. And off the bat, I would recommend this book. If you have not read Why I'm Afraid of Bees, I would definitely recommend checking it out. It's not great, but there's some stuff there to chew on and have fun with. Okay, so let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So, this book starts off with a typical caricature archetype that R.L. Stine likes to use in Goosebumps. You got the nerd archetype, and his name is Gary in this story. And Gary's kind of a loner, recluse type of kid because he's kind of outcasted from society as this nerd. He likes to read comic books in his backyard. He likes to play computer games in his room by himself because whenever he tries to, play baseball at his, school playground, kids pick him last and they give him an extra out because he's called Lutz the Klutz because Lutz is his last name and it just rhymes with Klutz. And this really gets under Gary's skin. And that happens as the story goes along. You'll pick up on this, but to get a gist of how the story plays out, because this story is easy to spoil, I'm only going to kind of skim the surface here. Gary one day is in his backyard reading a comic and he gets disturbed by a bee. And it turns out that the bee comes from his neighbor, Mr. Andretti, who keeps bees in his backyard. And it doesn't help that he's grown up his whole life living next door to this guy because one of his biggest fears, if not his biggest fear, is bees. And his fear kind of stems into being afraid of bee byproducts like honeycombs and honey itself. He's super afraid of bees. And early on, you kind of learn about how Mr. Andretti is a big jerk. And you really just don't like this guy. And you start to feel kind of sorry for Gary because as the story unfolds and Gary's monologue unfolds, you really get a sense of how society tends to beat up on him and how his family tends to ostracize him for his fears and how the neighbor likes to be a jerk to him about his fears. After a couple of things that happen in the first few chapters, they're not really important to bring up, but after a few important things, he's playing a computer game in his room one afternoon, and he's on this message board trying to figure out some hints on how to beat this game he's been trying to beat. And he sees this ad on the bottom of the computer screen, basically advertising, take a vacation from yourself. And Gary looks at it and examines it, and he starts to get this idea that maybe it would be cool to not have to be himself. As the ad states, it was only for 1 week, but at least he gets to have a break from being himself because he doesn't really appreciate anything he has in his life because he just thinks that he has it hard. Which, honestly, if I'm being honest, Gary's problems are definitely first world problems, like growing up in suburbia and stuff. But I think most people, especially American people, would really get Gary's point of view. I mean, he's not the most dimensional character, but he's very sympathetic up until this point. And Gary decides that it's time to maybe check this out. There's an address that's nearby in his town, and he gets to go explore that the next day. And when he goes and visits, he meets this woman And this woman sits him down and interviews him and tells him that people his age like to, switch bodies all the time. It's quick and painless. All they do is transfer the sentience of the brain over to one body, and the body you're switching with takes over your body in the sentient form. So Gary's like, sign me up. I need to do this immediately. And then before you know it, Gary, the very next day after doing that, he finds a match. But he doesn't know who this person is, but he's just ready to get it done. So the lady calls, says, hey, we found a match. She comes over to his house. But before all this goes down, Gary has another interaction with some of Mr. Andretti's bees. And he gets messed with the bees, and he comes inside before the woman comes over. And one of the bees may or may not have come inside with him. Now, when he's hooked up to this machinery to have this procedure done, something happens. A very scientific tragedy happens. To where Gary's sentience, as you can look on the cover, it's kind of misleading, but it's technically trying to say something here. Gary's sentience accidentally gets put into a bee. Alright? His body is being taken over by this other kid named Dirk, who plays an important role near the end. And Dirk's body is now taken over by the bee sentience. So there's a triad of exchange instead of a duality exchange here. So once Gary realizes that he's in a bee body, he panics, and he has a few close encounters, and this is where the book starts to get really tense and stakes-filled, because he's stuck in a bee's body. Bees have short lifespans, short metabolisms, are prone to getting swatted by humans. Nobody can hear what he's saying, and he has a few close encounters, especially with when the woman tries to leave. He almost gets run over by a car, and that's really nerve-wracking. And then he gets picked up by Mr. Andretti, who finds him and puts him into the beehive that he has in his backyard. And there's this descriptive thing about being inside the beehive in the beekeeping area in Mr. Andretti's backyard. And that's really, if you're afraid of bugs, it'll definitely make your skin crawl a little bit. But yeah, it made me a little nervous reading that. And after this scene unfolds, this is like midway through the story, he finds a way out, and then he has to pretty much find a way to get his body back. And he starts noticing that the new Gary, he's made friends with his family. Seems like his father seems really close to the new Gary. His sister and the new Gary seem to be cordial. He overhears the new Gary making friends with this crush that he has, and he's like embarrassed himself early on in the story, where he wrecks his bike in front of them, and they laugh at him, and he's wishing that he can just, in the puddle that he fell in, he can just become a tree to become invisible. It harkens back to that part of the story, and you start to really understand the urgency for Gary, because almost immediately Gary realizes what he gave up and how good he really had it compared to his life as a bee. So the story goes into that, where he's trying to get help. He can't have anybody listen to him because he's a bee. He has a close encounter with his sister, and he gets enough energy to go to the office place where he organized this whole thing, and he makes it there. And luckily, he's able to get inside where this woman works at that he had the procedure done with. And sure enough, the woman is able to hear him through a microphone. And this is where the woman kind of breaks the bad news. Apparently, there's some type of, I guess a consent form that they must have signed or something. Basically saying that, if you don't want to change bodies after you change bodies with somebody, you can't force them to change back. So this Dirk guy living in Gary's body, with at least with a sentience, doesn't want to give up his body, And Gary's pretty much stuck as a bee for now, and now she has to figure out a way to fix the situation. And he's left there, and he has no idea what to do next, but he keeps having to press on. It's urgent, he's a bee. And it harkens back throughout the story where he remembers this beekeeping book that he read, and he remembers certain facts, and he remembers that he probably only has a month or two left to live in the body that he's in. And unfortunately, he needs energy, so he needs to go back either to the beehive or get some nectar from a flower, stuff like that. So he's kind of pigeonholed to this body restraint he has. And he eventually makes it back home, and he makes it up to his room. And he, I kind of skimmed over the surface of an earlier event, but early on, he tried to leave a message on the computer, which went unnoticed by Dirk in Gary's body. And this time, he was determined to get right in, Dirk, aka Gary's ear, and tell him to give him his body back. And then then there's a plot twist that's revealed. Somehow, Dirk, aka the new Gary, can hear him. And it's kind of explained like he thinks that some of this insect thing transferred in his sentience to where he can hear the real Gary in the bee body perfectly fine. And there's this altercation where he's basically put his foot down saying, I'm not going to give up your body. I'm taking your body. I love your family. I love your life. You've taken your life for granted. And Gary gets upset. He goes back to the beehive, and he rumbles up some bees in the beehive, and he goes back to his room, and a big altercation happens. Now, I don't want to spoil the ending because it's very easy to spoil this entire book at this point. But let's just say something happens that may or may not have resolved the situation at hand, and things seemingly could be back to normal, except with the final end to the book kind of alluding that maybe this insect concept has lived on. And that's basically where I'll leave you with Why I'm Afraid of Bees. It's the book in a nutshell. So let's start off with the positives I have about the book. Off the bat, one thing I think this book does very well is that it lays out a story that's from start to finish, straight to the point story. I like that the book didn't, go into too many subplot things. Didn't try to introduce anything that it wasn't going to at least temporarily cover. It wasn't egregious, dropped concepts. Maybe near the end there was maybe one. But other than that, it was straight to the point. It was fast-paced. It was a book with only 117 pages. It had some ironic humor going for it. Gary was a sympathetic character. You really felt the empathy for him as the situations grew more dire and more tense. Ultimately, it has a recipe for something great here. There's a really resounding moral to this entire book as a whole about appreciating what you have in this life and not taking things for granted. And, there's also elements of be careful what you wish for. There's some science fiction elements going on. And the ending was kind of uplifting in a way. It was kind of on a happy note. I'm not going to spoil what the happy note is, but it was like that. And it felt like Gary went through a very extraordinary event and came out changed because of it. Conquering fears is also another thing that could be attributed to this story. Maybe or maybe not, Gary has conquered his fears of bees after his experience. A lot to think about with this book. But that goes without saying, this book does have its negatives, and I'll mention it. There's 3 huge negatives with this book. I want to say huge, actually. They add up to be huge. About like over a point off deduction. So off the bat, I'm going to tell you I'm probably going to give this book lower than a B. But I'll explain what these things are. And they all kind of tie together very closely. So going back to the pace of the book, it's very fast paced. It's only 117 pages. But the pacing of this book kind of creates two other additional problems. Mainly, the first problem is that, like most C tier or lower books in Goosebumps, this book has an issue of skimming details. And this kind of subsets off into another negative, which I'll kind of touch on. So the skimming would be like Gary, Gary wants to go somewhere, all right, and all of a sudden next chapter, or not even next chapter, next paragraph, he's there, you know, or Gary needs to think of something that could help him being in the bee body, and magic, he remembers a bee book he read. For someone being afraid of bee books, it kind of ties into another subset problem, which is plot convenience. This book is riddled with plot convenience throughout the entire story. And this starts with essentially how Gary finds the ad on his computer, right place at the right time. How this concept of mind transfer works is very vague, but there's enough there to kind of use your mind to fill in the blanks. It's not a complete drawback. Like I'm just being honest, most Goosebumps books, especially from this time, had a lot of plot convenience going on. And I'm not saying plot convenience is a huge negative. I can let a lot slide. But this book has a higher magnitude than most, especially with how the story plays out. Like I said, the skimming and the pace create this environment of reading experience where you notice the plot convenience going on. Especially near the end, where I think there's two main details of the entire climax that get, skimmed over and ultimately just plot convenienced out. One part of it is how the loophole thing happens with the choice of staying in someone's body. That's not really ever explained. There's enough there to imply, but that's a really big part of how the climax unfolds, unfortunately, and we don't really have a concrete answer there compared to what the book laid out. So, yeah, I kind of view that as a negative. But the big one I notice here is after this whole big event happens, Gary says that he's going to have to contact the woman that did this procedure to figure out how the situation somehow gets resolved. But it gets skimmed over at the end, and it just goes unexplained by the end. Which it's just one of those books that you're going to notice the plot convenience. It's there. I'm not going to pretend it's not there. It's very obvious. But it's there, and when you notice it, you can have fun with it. You know what I mean? It's not like a complete negative outright. You can have fun with it. Your imagination will go wild a little bit. But it's there, and I do kind of view it as a negative slightly, so I will bring that up. And another thing that I kind of want to throw into the ring, so we got the pace, introducing these things of skimming and plot convenience, and now we get into the main character, Gary himself. I'm not going to deduct any points on this, but I'm just going to be honest. How Gary came across was very one-dimensional. And I think this book could have benefited from more layers to Gary as a character. I think majority of the story was sympathizing with him based on his life experiences and how his experiences shape him throughout the story, more than interjecting different parts of his personality. I feel like he was very one-dimensional, as in the stereotypical wimp. But in his monologue, he was pretty honest about it. And I've had this experience in other books as well, where I felt the characters were kind of one-dimensional, didn't really show much personality, but I didn't deduct points, but they were kind of a reservation. Gary's no different, but I'm not going to deduct points, but I will just say I wish Gary had a little more personality, and it's a negative, but it's nothing I'll really deduct points on, kind of thing. So when it comes from a 0 to 5-star basis, I decided to give this book lower than a 4, like I said. Just the problems are there. But it's a fun book. It's a fun book. Things go unexplained because of the skimming and the plot convenience. It's there, like the whole reading a bee book, even though your biggest phobia is bees. Why would you read a bee book? What about the consent confidentiality thing that allows somebody just to have your body and stuff like that? And especially near the end, about how the situation resolves itself, really goes unexplained. But it's a fun book. And, it has similar problems to other average books in the C territory, the good books. But I had a blast reading this. This was pretty fun, straightforward. So from a 0 to 5 stars, I was going to give it between a 3.5 and a 3.9, and I settled on a 3.8. Only deducted 1.2 points off for those issues I mentioned. And yeah, I think this book is good. It's on the high end of good. I think it's slightly underrated. I don't think it's quite a D tier book. I think it's a high C. I give it a C plus. So yeah, I'd recommend this book. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Why I'm Afraid of Bees. Let me know down in the comments section if you have read this book before. Did you love this or did you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.